Obed was born during one of the most silent and somber times in Israel's history. The era of the judges still dominated the national landscape, marked by endless cycles of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance. The promised land, divided among the tribes, was in crisis, not for lack of territory, but for lack of direction. In those days there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The absence of strong leadership left the people vulnerable to external enemies and, even worse, to internal corruption. Faith had become fragile, and the altars were easily forgotten in the face of Canaanite idols that seduced the soul of Israel. It was a time when hunger afflicted not only the body but also the spirit. Families broke apart in search of sustenance, migrated, abandoned their inheritances, and often lost hope. It was in this context that Elimelech left Bethlehem with his wife Naomi and their 2 sons. They departed for Moab, a pagan land and historical rival of Israel, where provision was uncertain and spiritual risk even greater. And there, as if exile weren't enough, came the losses. Elimelech died. His sons, who had married Moabite women, also died. And Naomi, alone and bitter, decided to return to Bethlehem, taking with her only a young foreign widow named Ruth. It was among the dry fields of a spiritually starving nation and the humble streets of Bethlehem that Obed began to exist, even before he was born. He was the result of a reunion between Israel's forgotten faith and the faith discovered by a foreigner. The son of Ruth, the Moabite who dared to follow the God of Israel without guarantees. The son of Boaz, a righteous man descended from Judah, who honored the law of the kinsman redeemer and redeemed not just a woman, but a lineage. Obed came into the world as the answer to a silent prayer, a sign that even in the darkest days, God was writing something eternal. He wouldn't appear with swords or trumpets, but with the cry of a baby in an ordinary home. And even so, his life carried the promise of a new beginning. Because sometimes, God's plan doesn't start with a throne, but with a field of wheat. Not with a crowd, but with a willing heart. Obed grew up with bare feet on the red soil of Bethlehem. While other children ran carelessly through the barley fields, he carried something different in his gaze. It wasn't a burden. It was depth. As if, even without understanding, he knew his life came from far beyond the boundaries of his hometown. The house he lived in wasn't wealthy, but it held a warmth that didn't just come from the wood-burning oven or the boiling soup. It was the warmth of a story lived with faith, with tears, and with promises rescued from the dust. His mother, Ruth, wasn't an Israelite. He had known that from an early age, even before anyone told him. Not because of the tone in people's voices, but from the way some eyes hesitated to meet hers. Some respected her, of course. But there were also those who never fully accepted that a Moabite had found a place among the people of God. For Obed, however, that never dimmed the light of the woman who raised him with strength and gentleness. Ruth was a strong mother, marked by loss, but free of bitterness. She spoke little of Moab but told with passion the story of the day she decided to follow Naomi, not knowing where they would sleep, what they would eat, or if anyone would welcome them. "Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." These words echoed in Obed's memory like a sacred song. She repeated them as if repeating vows of covenant with her very life. Boaz, his father, was a different kind of man. Not just because of the respect he inspired in the town square and among the elders, but because of how he treated his family. He was already at the age when many gave up on new beginnings when he married Ruth. But for him, it wasn't just a marriage. It was obedience. An act of redemption. Boaz knew the pain of land losing its heir, of a woman left nameless, of a field abandoned without fruit. That's why, when he held in his arms that boy with warm skin and attentive eyes, he felt he wasn't just receiving a son, but sealing a story. Obed grew up to the sound of old stories, gathered like ears of wheat from the memory of his parents. Ruth spoke of the fields where she gleaned leftover barley, of hands wounded by labor, and of how God's mercy hid even in the smallest details. Boaz spoke of Judah, of Tamar, of Perez, his ancestors, and of the importance of honoring the land, the given word, and the inherited name. The boy listened carefully. He didn't ask much, but he stored every word like someone who knows that silence also teaches. At night, as the sky darkened over Bethlehem and the stars lit their watch, Ruth would cover him with a simple cloak and tell him, with tenderness, how God could turn the story of a foreign woman into a testimony for generations. "You're not just our son, my son. You are a miracle. You're the beginning of something we don't even fully understand." In the village, people spoke of him with curiosity. Obed wasn't like the other boys. He wasn't the strongest, nor the boldest. But there was something about his presence that drew attention. He liked being alone sometimes, walking through the wheat fields, listening to the wind pass through the stalks as if it were a voice. And even as a child, he treated elders with a respect that seemed to come from someone far older. He was gentle with animals. Never mistreated those who mocked him for his origins. It was as if he'd been born with the gift of embracing what the world rejects. Once, while helping his mother gather herbs near the field, Obed saw two men arguing. One of them shouted something at Ruth, calling her a rescued pagan. The boy froze, fists clenched, but didn't react. He just looked firmly at the man, with a gaze he himself couldn't explain. A look that didn't confront with anger, but with dignity. Ruth, seeing the scene, held her son's hand and said simply, "We serve the God who sees everything. We don't need to prove anything to anyone." That night, Obed asked his father why God would choose someone like his mother to be part of Israel. Boaz knelt beside him and said, "Because God sees the heart, my son. He doesn't choose the way men choose. Sometimes he plants the promise right in the soil no one expects. And your mother was that soil. Fertile with faith." Those words stayed with him. Obed began to realize that his life was a seed, small, yes, but filled with purpose. And over time, serving God no longer felt like a duty or a predetermined fate, but an honor. His very name, servant, began to make sense. He understood he was not a servant of men, nor a slave to the past. He was a servant of God's plan. A plan he couldn't fully see yet, but one that already pulsed inside him. The years passed, and Obed was no longer the boy who ran between bundles of barley with dust-covered feet. His shoulders had broadened, his hands had toughened from labor, and his steps had grown slower, not from weariness, but from awareness. Now, he knew where he stepped. Every stone, every trail between the crops, every corner of the land inherited from Boaz carried memories and promises. He felt it when he bent down to harvest, when he listened to the counsel of the elders, or when he gazed at the night sky as if searching for signs in the silence of God. In the modest house where he lived, work began early. Before the sun even rose over the hills of Judah, Obed was already up, preparing tools, checking equipment, helping the servants. Boaz had taught him that leadership doesn't begin when someone gives orders, it begins when someone serves. And he held fast to that principle. He didn't seek applause, nor did he avoid humble tasks. If something needed to be done, he did it. If someone needed help, he extended his hand. Despite his youth, the elders of the town began to notice his demeanor. It was rare to see someone his age stay silent when they could boast. Obed didn't speak much, but his actions told stories. And when he did speak, he weighed every word like someone who knew the value of silence. He knew how to listen, a rare quality, and that alone earned him respect even from those who still viewed his Moabite background with suspicion. Ruth, now older, watched her son with eyes of gratitude and quiet pride. She knew that, to many, her story was still a burden. But Obed never showed shame. On the contrary, he made a point of remembering where they had come from. "My mother is a Moabite, but her God is the God of Israel. And that's why I'm here." It was his way of affirming that identity is not limited to origin, but to covenant. Boaz, increasingly weakened by age, began to slowly pass on the responsibility of the house and fields to his son. With that came the invisible burdens every heir carries, not just to keep the land fertile, but to keep alive the memory and the faith that sustained it. Harvesting wasn't enough. One had to cultivate. In one of the hardest harvest seasons of that period, the rains came late, and many farmers lost part of their crops. Obed decided to set aside the first sheaves for the needy in the town. Some servants protested. "We'll lose even more, sir. We barely have enough." But he stood firm. "If there's little, then let's share the little. I'm not the one who makes it grow. It's the Lord of the harvest." That night, as he looked at the half-empty barn, he sat with his mother by the cold oven. She brought him a piece of dry bread, and he broke it in silence. After a while, he murmured, "Sometimes I wonder if I'm ready." Ruth smiled, her face lined with the wrinkles of time and hope, and replied, "You don't need to be ready for every challenge. You just need to be available to obey." The words struck deep. Obed didn't seek greatness, but he felt that his name carried something greater than he understood. He began to realize that his life wasn't an end in itself, but a link, a part of the chain of something God was weaving. There was no throne. There was no crowd. But there was a purpose growing quietly among the ordinary days. A few years later, Obed began preparing the house for a new season. It was time to start a family. Choosing a wife, in those days, involved more than love. It was also an act of responsibility. It wasn't just about forming a home but about keeping a lineage alive. And he knew the lineage he carried wasn't just any lineage. It came from Judah, passed through Tamar, through Boaz, through Ruth, stories of pain and redemption, faith and scandal, obedience and hope. The wedding was simple, but filled with meaning. Among the blessings spoken, one echoed in Obed's heart, "May the Lord establish your house like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." The same blessing that the elders of Bethlehem had once proclaimed over Boaz was now spoken over his son. The cycle was coming full circle. The words returned with new strength, not as repetition, but as continuation. Obed began to live with even more awareness. His days were filled with work, in the fields, with the animals, among the servants, but they were also rich with purpose. He began to teach the younger ones, to sit among the elders, to listen to the Levites when they came to town. He hungered to understand more about the God who had changed the destiny of his family. When his first son was born, his eyes welled with tears. He was a strong boy, with a firm cry. They named him Jesse. And as he held him in his arms, Obed felt the same thing his father had likely felt when he held him for the first time, that within that small body pulsed something eternal. Obed began teaching Jesse just as he had been taught, not with long speeches, but with presence. He would take him to the fields and show him the cycle of the seasons, the signs in the sky, the firmness of the roots. But above all, he taught him to fear the Lord, not with terror, but with reverence. "It's not the land that sustains us, Jesse. It's the God who made it." And so, quietly, without apparent glory, Obed became not only a faithful servant, but a father of generations. Jesse grew up in the same fields where his father, Obed, had learned to serve. The land was the same, but times were changing. Israel still had no king. The tribes continued living under the judges, temporary figures raised by God to deliver the people in times of distress. It was a period of uncertainty, where the people's faithfulness wavered like the seasons. In some cycles, they returned to the Lord. In others, they surrendered to neighboring gods, weakening their national identity and wounding their covenant with the Most High. From an early age, Jesse was trained by his father to live amidst instability without losing his center. Obed was discreet, but firm. He never exalted himself, never let the weight of his name become a source of pride. And Jesse learned from him that balance, honoring the lineage without vanity, fearing God without show. Time passed. Jesse became a man, took over the fields, the servants, and the family household. He married and had many children. Each child born was received with gratitude, but also with responsibility. For him, raising children was much more than providing food and shelter. It was sustaining the invisible thread that connected his generation to something greater than he could understand. Even without prophecies, even without angels announcing anything, he knew, deep down, that his family was part of something sacred. Jesse raised his children with discipline and reverence for the Lord. Teaching them to work was part of the routine, but the true instruction came in simple moments, around the table, in the silence of the fields, in the pauses for prayer when the rains delayed. He taught them to observe the cycles of life and to trust in the God who had sustained their family since the days of Boaz and Ruth. Among his sons, there were the strongest, the most skilled, the most confident. Eliab, the firstborn, was tall, with a striking appearance. He had stature and strength, and many believed he would inherit the leadership of the household. The other sons had their own virtues. Abinadab was intelligent and thoughtful. Shammah was quick and skilled in the field. Each had his place, his space, his role. And then there was the youngest, David. A boy of ordinary appearance, reddish hair, and an inquisitive, curious gaze. From a young age, he preferred being away from the bustle of the house. He enjoyed being among the sheep, strumming rudimentary harps made with his own hands, singing songs he created himself, looking at the sky as if talking to someone invisible. To many, he was just the youngest. The last. The unlikely one. On days when the brothers gathered, David was the one who brought the water, the one who did the simple tasks. He was never the first to be called, rarely the center of any plan. But Jesse observed him in silence. Not with favoritism, but with the awareness that only an attentive father develops. He saw something in the boy that he couldn't name, but also couldn't ignore. A lightness that concealed strength. A sensitivity that didn't keep him from work, but gave depth to simple things. David was different, but not distant. He was obedient, helpful, quick to learn. When Jesse entrusted him with the family's flock, he expected only that he would do the job well. But over time, he began to hear stories that went beyond the ordinary. David protected the sheep with unusual courage. He had already faced a bear. Another time, it was a lion. And he didn't boast about it. He told it as if he had simply done what was right. Once, Jesse found David sitting under the shade of an olive tree, looking at the sky and playing a soft melody on his harp. The father didn't interrupt. He just watched. And he felt something he didn't yet understand, as if that quiet song carried a prayer. A declaration of faith. A surrender. The days continued their course. Bethlehem remained peaceful, distant from Israel's decision-making centers. For Jesse, each season was a cycle to complete, planting, harvesting, caring for the family. He did what needed to be done. He didn't seek greatness, but neither did he ignore what he carried. He knew he came from Obed, who came from Boaz, and that this heritage was not just one of blood, but of mission. Then the news arrived. The prophet Samuel was coming to town. In Israel, the coming of a prophet was always a cause for commotion. The elders looked at each other with apprehension. A prophet could bring blessing, correction, judgment, or all at once. Samuel was no ordinary man. He was the last judge of Israel, the man who had anointed King Saul, the same man now searching for another chosen one. Jesse was surprised by the call. Samuel had not come by chance. God had sent his servant to Jesse's house, in search of a new king. It sounded absurd. How could a king come from his home? His sons were good men, but none of noble lineage, none had fought in battles. They were farmers, men of the land. But obediently, Jesse called his sons. Eliab was first. Imposing, dignified. But Samuel shook his head. The Lord does not see as man sees. One by one, the sons passed before the prophet. Abinadab, Shammah, and others. All rejected. Are these all the sons? Samuel asked. Jesse hesitated. There is still the youngest. He's in the field, with the sheep. Bring him, replied the prophet. And so, without knowing it, Jesse called the chosen one. David came from the field. The scent of earth, the sweat clinging to his skin, the face reddened by the sun, everything about him revealed that this summons had interrupted just another ordinary day. He had no idea what was happening at home. He only knew they had called him urgently. When he entered, breathless, his fingers still dusty and his staff in hand, he saw something he had never seen before. His brothers gathered in silence, his parents serious, and at the center of the room, an elderly man with a strong face and piercing eyes, Samuel. David froze. All eyes turned to him, and for a moment, no one said a word. It was as if time had held its breath. Until Samuel saw him. And God spoke to his heart. This is the one. Rise and anoint him. Right there, in the middle of the room, before all his brothers, the prophet stepped forward. He took the horn filled with oil and, with a firm and solemn gesture, poured it over the shepherd boy's head. The oil ran slowly, mixing with the sweat, dripping onto his simple clothes, marking his forehead like an invisible seal. Silence still hung in the air, but inside David, something had changed. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power, and his life would never be the same. Jesse watched everything with a mix of perplexity and awe. How could it be? The son no one had even considered worthy to be present was now being anointed by Samuel as king? It made no sense to human eyes. But Jesse had already learned from his family's history that God does not follow the world's logic. Boaz had chosen Ruth when no one else would. Obed was born from an improbable marriage. And now David, the youngest of all, was the chosen one of the Most High. Samuel left soon after, like a man who knew his mission was complete. There was no celebration. No public announcement. No crown, no throne. Just a secret anointing in God's presence upon a boy. The house returned to its rhythm, but nothing was the same. David, though he remained among the sheep, was no longer just a shepherd. He was anointed. But for now, only he knew. And perhaps not even he fully understood it. The oil dried from his skin, but the mark remained on his soul. Time passed. David continued serving, obeying, playing his harp, watching over the flocks, facing the wild beasts with the same courage as before. No one left in search of an army. No one came looking for him. He was still the youngest. Still seen as a boy among men. But heaven already recognized him as king. Meanwhile, far away, in the palace at Gibeah, King Saul was descending into an invisible abyss. The one who had once been chosen by God was now tormented by an evil spirit. His heart was restless. Peace had vanished. And his servants, powerless before the torment, sought a solution. Someone suggested, "There is a young man in Bethlehem who knows how to play the harp. He is brave, wise, and the Lord is with him." David was called. Again, not as a king. Not as a warrior. But as a musician. As a servant. Jesse prepared his son for the journey. The boy left carrying bread, wine, and a young goat. Simple gifts from a grateful father, offering what he had to serve the king. David arrived at the palace without fanfare. He played his harp. And the music brought relief to Saul's heart. The evil spirit would retreat each time the young man's fingers strummed the strings with devotion. And there, in the king's court, David served in silence. Without spotlights. Without honors. But with faithfulness. He knew that the anointing he had received was not a license to demand, but a calling to wait. And he waited, attentive, obedient, observing, learning. While the throne was not yet his, he prepared himself as a servant. He returned home whenever he could. Jesse received him with the same look as always, but now with a more watchful heart. He saw in his son's eyes a different firmness. It wasn't pride. It was purpose. And even without understanding it fully, the father knew David's time would come. But not yet. It was still early. And then came the war. The Philistines were camped against Israel, and among them, a champion, Goliath, the giant of Gath. Nearly 10 feet tall, he challenged the army of God every day. No one dared face him. Not even the most experienced soldiers. Not even the king himself. The humiliation was public. The fear, paralyzing. Jesse, worried about his older sons who were at the front lines, called David. "Take food to your brothers. See how they're doing." And the boy went. As a messenger. As a servant. Once again, not as a warrior. When he arrived at the battlefield, he saw what no one else saw, a man defying the living God, and an army cowering. To him, it was unacceptable. And the indignation in his chest grew until his words reached the king. Before Saul, David did not speak of swords. He spoke of faith. The same God who delivered me from the bear and the lion will deliver me from this Philistine. Saul hesitated, but saw no other option. He placed his own armor on David, but the boy refused it. He went to the stream, chose 5 smooth stones, and set out with his sling in hand. What happened in that valley would echo throughout the history of Israel. The giant fell. The unlikely one triumphed. And the name of David began to be whispered with reverence and awe. But it all began with a forgotten boy in the field. A son of Jesse. A descendant of Obed. A faithful servant who waited for the right time. Obed's story never occupied the main stages of Israel. His name doesn't appear among the prophets, nor in the Psalms, nor in the most remembered wars. He was not a judge, not a king, and performed no miracles. And yet, his existence upheld the lineage that would change the destiny of an entire nation and the world. He was the son of a foreign woman and a righteous man. Born in times of divine silence, he grew up amid the dust of Bethlehem, between harvests and whispered prayers. Obed learned from his mother that God does not reject those who come with a broken heart. And he learned from his father that serving is an act of redemption. When he became a father, he passed this on to Jesse. And Jesse, in turn, taught it to David. Nothing in his life was grand in the world's eyes. But everything was essential before God. Because it was through faithfulness in the details, through obedience in simple routines, that he kept alive the hope that would later take shape in the hands of a shepherd anointed as king. Obed was the kind of man who carried history in his heart, even if no one saw it in his eyes. He was the link between generations. The hidden pillar beneath the temple structure. The root that supported the fruit, still invisible. And when David finally ascended to Israel's throne, when the heart became a scepter and the field became a palace, perhaps he remembered his grandfather. Perhaps, on a quiet night, looking out from the terrace to the sky, he whispered Obed's name with gratitude. Because everything he was began with someone who simply served. Obed's name remained in the genealogies, as a sign that God's plans don't skip steps. They are fulfilled with precision, with patience, with promises preserved in the womb of history. From Obed came Jesse. From Jesse, David. And from David, generations later, was born Jesus, the Son of the living God. The Gospel of Matthew does not begin with miracles, nor with sermons. It begins with a lineage. And there he is, discreet but essential. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth, Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot King David. Obed is among the few names that bridge the Old and New Testaments. And perhaps that is the most powerful aspect of his story. He represents those who do not shine but uphold. Those who are not crowned, but form kings. Those who are not in the Psalms, but without whom there would be no one to write them. His life was a field plowed with obedience. A home built with faith. a seed planted in silence that grew to become the tree from which the Messiah would come. Because the kingdom of God is not born only in palaces. It sprouts in humble homes, among faithful fathers and children taught to fear the Lord. Obed's story reminds us that God's purpose does not depend on visibility. It depends on faithfulness. That being small is not being irrelevant. That serving does not mean being forgotten. And that every act of obedience, no matter how simple, can carry the weight of generations. Today, few speak of him. Few remember his name. But in heaven, his memory is eternal. And here on earth, his legacy remains alive, not in monuments, but in hearts that understand that true greatness begins with a yes behind the scenes of history. Because it was through men like Obed that the God of Israel revealed to the world that no life is ordinary when it is lived with purpose. That no origin is despicable when it is redeemed by love. And that no generation is lost when there is one righteous person to sustain it in reverence. In the genealogy of heaven, the great ones are those who serve. And Obed was one of them. Obed did not live for himself. His story was not about visible achievements, but about invisible roots. He did not seek to be remembered, but he was faithful. And it is precisely for this reason that his life remains a silent foundation and one of humanity's greatest promises. From him came Jesse. From Jesse, David. And from David's lineage came Jesus, the King of Kings. Obed teaches us that the kingdom of God is not built by those who seek greatness, but by those who obey in daily life. By those who work in silence, raise children with faith, welcome foreigners with compassion, and dedicate themselves to small things as if they were eternal, because before God, they are. Today, maybe you feel like Obed. Without titles. Without visibility. Just doing what is right. Maybe you think your life is too ordinary, too simple, too small to make a difference. But Obed's story proves the opposite. God writes the greatest chapters through those who remain faithful when no one is watching. You don't need a crown to live with purpose. You just need to say, "Here I am, Lord." And let him use your life, your family, your gifts, even the simplest ones, to sustain something eternal. Be like Obed. Choose one act of quiet faithfulness. Serve someone. Pray for someone. Teach something to your children. Honor your family. Carry out a simple task with excellence. Not for recognition, but for obedience. Because in the end, the greatest legacies are not left by those who shined, but by those who serve with love.